All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and our program today is If I May, Mr. President, Advisors from Washington's Cabinet, and it's being presented to us by George Washington's Mount Vernon. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. It's a free series we put on every year from January through April. This is just a quick reminder that by participating today, you are agreeing to be recorded and archived. We do keep recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel so that teachers and students can access them later. All right, we absolutely want you to participate today. It's a lot more fun that way. If you haven't already, go ahead and pull up your chat box. It looks kind of like a little caption bubble. Feel free to share where you're joining from today. As we go through the program, this will be the easiest way for you to interact and ask your questions. You also have the option to be on video. If you'd like to be on video, just leave me a message in the chat and I will work on promoting you. Again, ask as many questions as you like. It's a lot more fun if we get to interact with you. That said, just be really respectful of our interactive tools. We want to make sure that any questions we're asking, any comments we're making, that they're directly related to what our presenter is speaking about today. And with that, I just want to thank you one more time and direct you to our website. If you're interested in our upcoming programs or you're looking for our recordings, you can find all that information on our website. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and pass it over to our presenters who you came to see.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. This is such an exciting opportunity. My name is Denver Brunsman. I'm a history professor at George Washington University. I'm the chair of the history department. And so I'm talking to you from Washington, D.C., actually not too far from the National Archives. And what a great topic today. We're talking about the origins of the cabinet and George Washington's advisors. And I'm here in concert with George Washington's Mount Vernon. So Chika, I don't know if you want to say hello real quick.
Hi everyone, my name is Sachika Ghosh and I'm the lead specialist for student learning at George Washington's Mount Vernon. So this means that it's my job to help students all around the world, just like you, learn about George Washington, the precedents that he set during his career and his lifetime, and how his legacy is still very much alive today. So we're going to talk about one of these precedents, which is the establishment of the presidential cabinet. And for that, of course, we have Denver, who is going to lead a terrific presentation. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. Back over to you, Denver.
Okay, terrific. And at the end, Sachika will be able to talk a little bit more about what Mount Vernon does for teachers and some of the programs. But for now, I'm going to share my screen here to get into the history of the cabinet. And one thing I want to emphasize at the outset is that this is something that we almost take for granted. I mean, I think we do take it for granted because this is so much part of the American government today. But one thing that historians have to do is always question where things come from. Why do we have different institutions like the cabinet? And, we never want to accept anything as just inevitable, meaning that it was bound to happen. That's actually the worst swear word in history is so bad that it has 10 letters, not just 4, inevitable. As soon as we say that something's inevitable, there's really no reason to question or search for the reasons why. So we're going to go down to the roots and figure out where this thing called the cabinet came from and how George Washington invented this and contributed it to the U.S. government. So we'll start by just thinking about the cabinet today because it's such, as I said, it's such a fundamental part of the U.S. government. And if we look at President Biden's cabinet today, it's actually huge. There's 26 people that are in the cabinet. That's the heads of 15 executive departments that you see listed here and 10 cabinet level officials. And don't worry, there's not going to be a quiz on all of these positions or people. I just want you to get a sense of how much this institution has grown. The names that are in yellow on this slide represent the original size of the cabinet in George Washington's presidency. So originally there was just the Departments of State, Treasury, what at the time was called the Department of War, now the Department of Defense, and the Attorney General, who's the head of the Justice Department, which actually came later in the 1800s after Washington's presidency. And the order of everyone listed here actually matters because it's all part of the presidential succession. So if something were ever to happen to the president, there's a set order for who follows in line. And some of this is set by the Constitution itself, and some of it is by an act of Congress. And so the Constitution makes very clear that the next person in line after the president is the vice president. And you can see that Vice President Kamala Harris really has her own category here within the cabinet because she's not the head of an executive department or a cabinet level official. She's actually an elected official, an elected office. So after the vice president, it's the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who today is Mike Johnson of Louisiana, would be the next in line to be president. After that, it's something called the President Pro Tem of the Senate. This is the longest serving member of the US Senate from the majority party, which is currently the Democrats. And so that would be Patty Murray of Washington State would be the next person. And after that, we actually get into these cabinet officials. And the order that they're listed is when they were created by Congress. So the oldest executive department is the Department of State. So Antony Blinken would be the first cabinet official in line to become president. And that's, of course, assuming that the Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem and the Vice President were not president. After that, it'd be Treasury, Defense, and then the Attorney General. This issue, unfortunately, does matter because 9 times in American history, the vice president has become president, 8 times because the president passed away, and 1 time because the president resigned in the case of Richard Nixon. Fortunately, the line of succession has never gone any further than that, but it's good to know how all this works. So where did this come from, this thing called the cabinet? Well, a place where we might look would be the Constitution. And there's no better place to look than George Washington's own Constitution, which is actually held at Mount Vernon. This is a book that's called the Acts of Congress, which was printed during Washington's presidency. And it actually includes a copy of the Constitution that we know that he marked on. And if you look on the far right, and I'll bring my cursor over here, there's different places where he wrote powers, president, and required, meaning those are the things that he was supposed to do. And, this is really amazing because what he's essentially saying is, I don't do all these other things. So this is really the definition of limited constitutional government that George Washington is saying, these are the things I do as president. And one of the things that is actually listed is in Article 2, which is the part of the Constitution that describes the executive branch. And what it says is, he, meaning the president, he may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. So if we put that into 21st century English, what it's basically saying is that the president can ask the heads of executive departments at any time for their advice, for their opinion, basically for their expertise in helping him or eventually her to govern. Notice that it doesn't have the word cabinet anywhere. So this is never mentioned actually in the Constitution. It doesn't say that the president will form a cabinet. And so we know then that this is something that came about during Washington's presidency. And I guess the next question we have to ask is, where did he get the idea? Because in the Constitution, it doesn't even list the executive departments. These were created by the first federal Congress in 1789. Again, starting with the Department of State, Treasury, and War. And it doesn't say exactly how they should be organized. Well, I'm going to give you a hint by showing this image from the musical Hamilton, which I'll be using at different times today during the presentation. This is my favorite George Washington. My favorite person who's played George Washington is Christopher Jackson. And you can see in wearing the uniform, that's the hint. This idea of the cabinet really came from Washington's experience in the Revolutionary War when he would gather all of his officers together in what he called a war council. So he would have his leading officers, say around a table, really trying to map out strategies for different battles and campaigns. And he found that so useful that he eventually decided to do that with his own heads of executive departments. But it took him a while. It took him a couple years into his presidency before he actually had those people meet. So you might be asking, I mean, how do we trust this? How do we trust that this actually started during the Revolutionary War? Well, I had a chance to ask George Washington himself in an interview once on Zoom, just like this, and he told me so. So you can see that this was a real thrill for me to talk to Christopher Jackson. One other thing just to keep in mind is that there was a precedent for the cabinet in British politics at the time. They had some idea of a cabinet, but that was not something that George Washington necessarily wanted to emulate or say that he was getting the idea from the British, because after all, the Americans had fought the British in the Revolutionary War, and that could be controversial with some members of the American public. So let's see, let's keep on rolling and just kind of think a little bit more about the origins of the cabinet. So this is the type of room where George Washington might have met with his original war council during the Revolutionary War. This is the room for the aides de camp. The aides de camp, that's basically a fancy way of saying like a chief of staff or a staff member. Different people had this role for George Washington. Most of you have probably heard of Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, who I'm going to be talking a lot about. He actually began as an aide de camp to George Washington. So he was someone who was both part of that original war council and became a member of the first cabinet. One of Washington's generals, Henry Knox, was the same, the first secretary of war. So we can imagine people sitting around these types of tables, working together on different military campaigns in the Revolutionary War. So we know where the cabinet came from now. Let's see how it actually worked. And I'm going to begin by just sharing an image of the first cabinet. And I really like this picture because it's hard to imagine any group of guys who were less likely to have a rap battle than these guys, like they do in the musical Hamilton. But go ahead and list the first members of the cabinet. And you can see to the far left, that's the first president, George Washington. Next to him is the person I mentioned, Henry Knox, who was a general in the Revolutionary War and became the first Secretary of War. Standing in the picture is Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, who had also been an officer in the Revolutionary War. Seated next to Hamilton is Thomas Jefferson, the first Secretary of State. And next to him is Edmund Randolph, the Attorney General. And so Washington always included the Attorney General in his cabinet. And you might notice that someone is, conspicuously absent. And that would be the first Vice President, John Adams. George Washington and John Adams were not super close. And Washington had a lot of questions about the office of Vice President. In the Constitution, it says the Vice President is President of the Senate. And that's really today a ceremonial role. Although if there's a tie vote in the Senate, the Vice President can break that tie, which has been important at different points in American history. But Washington wasn't sure if the Vice President really was more of a part of the legislative branch or the executive branch. And because of that, he didn't include Adams in his cabinet meetings. So I guess one of the most unexpected developments with this first group of people that Washington selected to be the heads of the various executive departments and members of his cabinet is that they were going to break into political parties. They actually had such strong opinions about how America should be run and the future of the country that, in particular, Alexander Hamilton, again, the person standing there, the first Treasury Secretary, and Thomas Jefferson, the person seated next to him on our right, on Hamilton's left, they formed their own political parties. Hamilton headed the Federalist Party, and Jefferson headed the Democratic Republicans. And it can be kind of confusing because Jefferson's party went by the nickname the Republicans, but it's not the same party as the Republicans today. It's actually, in many ways, the roots of the party that has become the Democratic Party today. The Republican Party would come along much later in the 1850s, and the Federalist Party, one of his original parties, actually died off by the 1820s. Well, we're used to political parties, so we might ask, what's the problem? What's the problem that Washington's cabinet broke into political parties? Well, at the time, it was something that neither George Washington nor these various cabinet members really wanted, because there was a real stigma attached to political parties. Americans thought it was something that was very British, something that could be destructive for their new country. And so they were trying to avoid having political parties. That wasn't the original intention, but it eventually became unavoidable. And so let's talk about some of these individual people and the ideas that they had. And we'll start with the person who was the most influential member of Washington's cabinet, and that was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was a genius with numbers, really a math genius and a financial genius. He had grown up in the Caribbean and had worked for a merchant firm and really understood through that experience how trade worked. And he also understood the benefits of the British economic system. And so he wanted certain features of the British economic system recreated in America. Well, this was very controversial, again, because America had fought the British in the Revolutionary War. And here's a list of some of the specific ideas that Hamilton had. He thought great nations should have a national debt. And after the Revolutionary War, the United States actually had 13 separate state debts. He wanted that all in one larger debt. There would need to be a national bank in order to help finance that national debt, and also just to help grow the early American economy, to create economic activity. The problem is that there was something called the Bank of England that already existed. And so again, it looked like Hamilton was really, copying the British system. If a government is to run, it needs revenue. And so Hamilton also proposed a number of excise taxes. These are taxes on various goods. At the time, the taxes were on things like tea and wine and other forms of alcohol, all in an effort to raise money for this new government. And the last part of the program is that Hamilton really wanted a manufacturing economy. He wanted an economy in which things were made, that new products were made. And early on, this is the very beginning of factories. The very first factories often made cloth and clothing and different fabrics. But of course, over time, they would make all kinds of different things. And today, we manufacture just about everything, including automobiles, airplanes, things that they couldn't have imagined in Hamilton's time. So this was his economic program. And I mentioned that his rival within the cabinet was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had a very different vision of America's future. And for Jefferson, he really wanted America to be an agricultural power, not a manufacturing country. This is a picture of his estate, his plantation in Virginia called Monticello. Unlike Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson enslaved a number of people. So Thomas Jefferson practiced slavery, and that's really was his vision of agriculture. And that was something else that was controversial on the other side for people in the North and people who followed Hamilton. So these were two very different economic visions. And it took a long time, really. It took, generations, really, for the United States to work this out. And for a long time, I think that they kind of did both. They were both, agriculture and manufacturing. And of course, we still have both to this day. But I think eventually Hamilton's vision, won out over what Jefferson wanted was just a nation of independent farmers. So I mentioned the musical Hamilton, which I imagine some of you are familiar with. If you're lucky enough to have Disney Plus, you can stream the original cast. You can see it that way. If not, you can certainly listen to the music for free online. And it's a good way to learn about these new these different figures from the Revolutionary War period, but also into Washington's presidency and the original cabinet. And I'm going to just talk about a song from Hamilton in order to illustrate how these different uh, cabinet members worked, especially before the cabinet started meeting in person. And the song is called "The Room Where It Happens." And what it's about is how, at least initially, Hamilton and Jefferson were able to find a compromise on these issues, particularly over the issue of a national debt. And it would really be the last compromise that they forged together. After that, they would really disagree so much that again they formed these different political parties to pursue their different visions of America. So in this song, the narrator, as he is through most of the musical, is Aaron Burr, who was a rival of Alexander Hamilton's throughout much of his life. And he tells this story about a dinner party that took place in which Jefferson hosted James Madison, another Virginian, who was another important founder, and agreed with Jefferson on a lot of ideas. They hosted Alexander Hamilton to talk about these ideas. And I'm going to spare all of you and certainly not sing today, but I'll give a dramatic reading of just part of this song of what Aaron Burr says. And he says, two Virginians and an immigrant walk into a room, diametrically opposed foes. They emerge with a compromise, having opened up doors that were previously closed. The immigrant emerges with unprecedented financial power, a system he can shape however he wants. The Virginians emerge with the nation's capital. And so the immigrant that Burr is talking about is Alexander Hamilton, since he was from the Caribbean. And in those short lines, he really explains what historians call the Compromise of 1790. Jefferson and Madison agreed with Hamilton. They let him have his national debt, but in exchange, they wanted to pick the location of the nation's capital. And because they were from Virginia, they picked an area around the Potomac River, which is right next to what has become the capital because of this deal, Washington, D.C. And so this is how Washington, D.C. became what was originally called the seat of government and what today we call the nation's capital. So let's go back and see how this actually happened, and then we'll see how well the musical tells the story. So for the actual history, we're going to go to the original seat of government under the Constitution, and that was New York City. And this is the second executive residence, the second place George Washington lived. So presidents haven't always lived in the White House. Starting in 1789, this is where Washington lived into 1790. And the story starts here because Alexander Hamilton was very depressed because he didn't see that his economic program was going to get through Congress. And as the first Treasury Secretary, he cared very deeply about this. Now, again, this is before the cabinet was meeting formally together, and I'll talk about that shortly. But we can see cabinet members already working together and trying to solve different problems. And so Jefferson happened to run into Alexander Hamilton right outside this executive mansion. And Hamilton explained, everything that was going wrong. And we have a primary source, something that Thomas Jefferson wrote about this meeting. And I'll just read you the first couple of lines because it's kind of funny because it's written a couple of years later when he was mad at Alexander Hamilton. So he doesn't make Hamilton look very good. He says, going to the president's one day, I met Hamilton as I approached the door. His look was somber, haggard, and dejected beyond description. Even his dress uncouth and neglected. He asked to speak with me. So he's saying that, gosh, Hamilton was really down on his luck, but he asked to talk to Jefferson. And this is where Jefferson came up with the idea to invite him to a dinner party in order to talk about their different problems. So this is what this looked like originally. This is in Lower Manhattan in New York City. This is the building in the same location today. And it's not the original building that was actually torn down, but you can see the current building, which is kind of a multi-purpose office building, like so many buildings in New York City. So So this is the making of this compromise of 1790. So let's look at the current building where Jefferson lived, or the current location. The building again is gone, but there's another plaque that said this is the site of where Thomas Jefferson lived in New York City, and this is where he invited Madison and Hamilton to dinner. And so the famous thing about this song from the Hamilton is that this is the room where it happened. This is where this big deal was made. And it doesn't describe everything that happened in the meeting because the whole point is nobody was there. Now, one small correction we have to make is that Jefferson, as I talked about, he enslaved African Americans. And so there was almost certainly an enslaved servant that would have been at this meal. So there was at least one other person and possibly more that would have been in the room where it happens. So in the song, we hear kind of what took place. It says, the chorus says, in God we trust, but we'll never really know what got discussed. The room where it happened, no one really knows how the game is played, the art of the trade, how the sausage gets made. We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens. But fortunately, again, we have these primary sources, these records that Jefferson wrote and left behind. So he described, the basic portions of this deal, the different components of it. We also have other reactions that people had. And as you can imagine, people in New York City weren't very happy because of this deal, they were going to lose the nation's capital. But the Northeast wasn't going to lose it right away. There was an interesting kind of part of this deal, and that was that for 10 years, the seat of government was going to move to Philadelphia. So from 1790 to 1800. And the reason for that is because this location that was picked along the Potomac, which is Washington, D.C. today, wasn't very populated at the time. There was just a few communities around present-day Georgetown, the Georgetown neighborhood, and the present-day town of Alexandria, Virginia. Otherwise, not too many people lived here. So they were actually going to have to build this new city almost from scratch. And a lot of people in Philadelphia didn't think it would actually work. So they thought they might be getting the nation's capital forever. So a fun question to ask is, who actually got the better part of this deal? Who actually won? And I'll say that in the musical Hamilton, Hamilton's the star of the musical, and it sort of portrays him as the winner. And so we'll show Hamilton dancing here since since he won this deal, and I'll again share some of the lines. And Burr asks, Hamilton says, "What did you say to they say to you to get you to sell New York City down the river? Did Washington know about it, the dinner? Was there presidential pressure to deliver?" And then he kind of changes his tone, and Burr asks, he says, "Or did you know even then it doesn't matter where you put the U.S. Capitol?" And Hamilton agrees. He says, "Because we'll have the banks, we're in the same spot." And Burr says, "You got more than you gave." And Hamilton says, "And I wanted what I got." When you got skin in the game, you stay in the game, but you don't win unless you play in the game. Oh, you get love for it, you get hate for it, you get nothing if you wait for it. God help me and forgive me. I want to build something that's going to outlive me. And then so Hamilton is basically saying, that he played this game, that he was in the room where it happens, and that he got the better of the trade. And what's really fascinating is if we look at other primary sources, Thomas Jefferson basically agrees with this. 2 years later, he wrote a letter to George Washington, basically saying that this was the biggest mistake he had ever made, that he should have never given Hamilton the national debt, because once Hamilton had the national debt, it was hard to stop the rest of his financial program. And these are Jefferson's words. He said that he had been duped by the Secretary of the Treasury and made a fool for forwarding his schemes, not then sufficiently understood by me. And of all the errors of my political life, this has occasioned me the deepest regret. And Jefferson went on to say this. He said, this deal, this compromise of 1790, it went on to change the political complexion of the government of the United States. So those are pretty big words. And again, this is all happening within Washington's cabinet in the very first years. Well, we'll look at George for a second, because George certainly got something out of this deal, and that was having the seat of government near his home of Mount Vernon in present-day Northern Virginia. And in this painting, which he liked very much, he liked it so much, he ordered 4 copies of it for Mount Vernon. He's looking at an early plan for the new federal city, as it was known. This was done by Pierre, also known as Peter Lafont. He was the person that came up with the plan. And you can see, moving from left to right, George Washington's step-grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. If you know anything about Washington, D.C., the Washington, D.C. area, you maybe have seen Arlington Cemetery or maybe even visited it. George Washington Parke Custis, as an adult, built Arlington House, what eventually became Arlington Cemetery. Eleanor Parke Custis is the next child moving to the right, better known as Nellie. And she was really a star in Washington's world. Very, very smart, very talented in all kinds of things, including music. Next is Martha Washington, of course, George Washington's wife. And then there's an enslaved man standing there. And for a long time, the curators at Mount Vernon thought this might be Christopher Shields, one of the house valets at Mount Vernon. But recent interpretations have shifted, and we think now that the artist was just putting an abstract enslaved figure, almost to stand for the hundreds of enslaved people that were at Mount Vernon at the time. So again, through this deal, Washington, got the nation's capital near Mount Vernon. Hamilton got the national debt, and as I mentioned, the executive residence was going to move from New York to Philadelphia for 10 years. So let's look at an image of that executive residence. And this is a really cool image that's courtesy of a good friend and colleague of mine, Lindsay Shabinsky, and the SMU Center for Presidential History, as you can see in the slide. We have this digital image of the house because it doesn't actually exist anymore. So this is a neat recreation. Kind of think about what it might have looked like. Now, in the first couple of years of his presidency, the way that Washington basically dealt with his cabinet was to write to them, kind of like the Constitution suggested. And we know that Washington read the Constitution closely. So he would send out these letters basically asking, each of his cabinet members to weigh in on a different issue. And one of the biggest issues in which he did this was with the First National Bank. I mentioned that was part of Hamilton's financial program. And originally, Thomas Jefferson was very, very opposed to this. He told George Washington that he thought it was unconstitutional because the Constitution didn't say that the executive branch could just go on and create, a bank. Hamilton had a much different opinion. He thought that it was constitutional, that the Constitution gave room for actions like this through the what's known as the elastic clause of the Constitution, that the executive branch could do things that basically fulfilled the spirit of the larger document. And this is a debate that we have to this day, is what's exactly permitted under the Constitution. So again, all of this began in Washington's time, and this further fractured the cabinet into these first political parties. So eventually, these people finally start to meet in person. And you can see listed here the date for the very first cabinet meeting in person. I feel like the cabinet was operating before this time, through writing and through things like that dinner party at Jefferson's apartment. But the first actual meeting was on November 26, 1791. And there would eventually be 99 cabinet meetings in George Washington's 2 terms. And I'm guessing he wasn't keeping track, because you would think he would just have one more meeting to get to the big round number of 100. So by this point, even at the very first meeting, Jefferson and Hamilton are already rivals and very suspicious of one another. And I'm going to show you, again, courtesy of Lindsay Shabinsky and SMU, this digital rendering of what Washington's private study would have looked like. And this is where the cabinet met. And it's not a very big space. And so I can imagine these people, really getting irritated on each other's nerves. Hamilton uh, talked a lot, which drove Jefferson crazy. But a lot of even though they didn't always get along, I think a lot of productive things came out of these different meetings. And in this first, series of cabinet meetings, the issue that really dominated everything in Washington's government was the prospect of global war. And this was because of the French Revolution. So the French Revolution is traditionally, historians mark the origin date as July of 1789 with the storming of the Bastille prison in Paris. And that's what this image shows. And what's so interesting about that is Washington became president in April of 1789. So basically, most of his presidency coincided with the French Revolution. And at first, George Washington and most Americans were very excited about the French Revolution. George Washington was so excited that he actually accepted and celebrated receiving a key to the Bastille prison, that image that we just saw, a key that was provided to him by the Marquis de Lafayette, the French aristocrat who had fought with the Americans in the Revolutionary War. George Washington was so proud of this, he immediately put it on display in that executive residence in Philadelphia that we saw the image for. And then after his presidency, he brought it to Mount Vernon. And it's one of the only objects that has never left Mount Vernon ever since. But what happened is the French Revolution became more and more radical and more violent over time. And as that happened, Washington began to distance himself from it. He didn't approve of it quite as much. Alexander Hamilton also was very worried about the French Revolution. And while Thomas Jefferson had some concerns, he supported it much more than either of those two men. So this was part of the fracturing of the cabinet again. So why did all of this matter? Well, George Washington had to decide what to do once the French actually executed their own king and queen. And that's a real grisly process using this device called the guillotine that's depicted in this particular image. It would actually cut off people's heads. That's how violent this revolution was. And so George Washington had to make a decision because America was actually allied with France through a treaty. The French had helped the Americans in the Revolutionary War. And now, because of these violent actions, they were going to go to war with Great Britain, the other sort of major power of Europe. And there was a lot of concern that the United States would get involved in this war, and that because they were allied with France, they would have to fight against Great Britain. And so this was a big issue that Washington tried to come to some conclusion with his cabinet. And so what he often did with the cabinet is he would send them a bunch of questions before a meeting. And in this case, Washington sent 13 questions to the various cabinet members and basically asking them, the main question that he had was the United States obligated to remain allied with France, even though the original French government had disappeared and had literally, died with the killing of the king and the queen. The other question he had is whether the president or the executive branch on its own could end a treaty. And on both of these questions, Hamilton thought that the United States didn't have to remain allied with France, and that the executive very well, could end a treaty. Again, Jefferson disagreed, but they met and they deliberated, and eventually, Washington was satisfied with the idea that the United States didn't have to be allied to France any longer. And he issued something called the Neutrality Proclamation, saying the United States would remain neutral in this war. And by doing that, he also assumes some real powers for the executive that the president has to this day. So this gives you some idea of what the first cabinet actually did. Well, that first cabinet, nobody stays in the cabinet forever. And all the original cabinet members eventually left Washington's administration. And this is his cabinet at the end of his presidency. You have all different figures: Timothy Pickering as Secretary of State, Oliver Wolcott Jr. as Secretary of the Treasury, James McHenry as Secretary of War, Charles Lee as the Attorney General, all accomplished men, but certainly not as accomplished or as famous as the original cabinet. And for that reason, Lindsay Sheminsky often refers to this group as the B team. And that often happens in a president's second term. Washington was very sentimental, particularly at Alexander Hamilton leaving the cabinet in 1795, and wrote him, a very laudatory letter ending his term. Um, so so this is kind of just a big picture right now of Washington's cabinet, and shortly I want to get into your questions, and so feel free to put questions in the chat. I want to address any issues that might come up, but I want to close with just a different idea of just something for you to think about. There's the formal cabinet that exists to this day, but there's also other people who advise the president, and they've been called different things throughout American history. President Andrew Jackson had something that was referred to as the kitchen cabinet. This was kind of his informal group of advisors. And George Washington had that too. And he actually relied on a number of women, educated women, to help him make different decisions. I just want to give you a few different examples of that here at the end, just to show that it's not just the formal cabinet that advises a president. So if we think about the different women who helped George Washington, we have to start with Martha Washington, right? His wife. And Martha Washington was key to all of George Washington's success for a lot of reasons, but one is for the simple reason that she provided a lot of wealth to the marriage. When she married George Washington, she was the richest widow in Virginia and likely the entire, British colonies in North America. And so this really helped to catapult George Washington into gentleman status that made everything possible. So this is actually the most important painting we have of Martha Washington. We think that it's the closest to what she might have looked like later in life. And it's called the Athenaeum portrait by Gilbert Stuart. And we have the same portrait for George Washington. And just to go on a real quick kind of fun tangent here, this is also a very important portrait of George Washington. Even though it's unfinished, it's considered the most important likeness of his face at the end of his life and at the end of his presidency. But the artist Gilbert Stuart said that when he was making this painting, George Washington was very irritated by his dentures, by his false teeth, that they're very uncomfortable and that he wasn't very happy. And so you never see George Washington smiling in different portraits. And there's a good reason for that. These are George Washington's false teeth that are kept at Mount Vernon, one of the many amazing objects that Mount Vernon has. And they were made of many different animals. So there was hippopotamus, there was cow's teeth, there was horse's teeth, there was even human teeth, possibly from enslaved people, and we don't know that for certain. But put together, this was one of the technological marvels of its time. It was spring-loaded, and Washington needed them. He only had one of his own teeth when he became president. So that Athenaeum portrait of George Washington is the basis for the dollar bill. So the next time you see a dollar bill, you can take a little bit of pity on George, his poor mouth. But let's get back to Martha Washington. Martha Washington was once young, like everyone, and we might think of her as a younger person. The painting to the left was done by an artist named John Wollaston, and this is done in the year that Martha Washington's first husband died. And she met George Washington. And the painting to the right imagines what she might have actually looked like using forensics technology at Louisiana State University. John Wollaston did a lot of good things as an artist, but he wasn't very good at painting faces. Everybody looks the same. Even babies have the same Wollaston face. So I mentioned that Washington depends on women in different ways. Martha really helped to ground him and really helped him, I think, politically as president, in part by just entertaining people, but also just putting people at ease. She was very down to earth, and held a weekly event every Friday in which men and women were invited and they could meet the Washingtons, and it was a social event in order to make people of different political ideas get along. And it was pretty different than George Washington's own event he had every week. That was on Tuesdays, and only men were invited, and it was painfully formal and stiff, in which Washington would go around in a circle, bowing at different men and talking briefly. Even he liked Martha's event much more. I'm going to give you an example of one other woman who was very influential in advising George Washington, and that is someone named Elizabeth Willing Powell, painted here again by John Wollaston. So no, that's not Martha Washington. As I said, a lot of Wollaston's faces look the same. Elizabeth Willing Powell was in Philadelphia during those years when Washington was president. She was also there for first the Continental Congress, the first and second Continental Congress in 1774 and 1775, and that's when George Washington first met her. And she was also there for the Philadelphia Convention that produced the Constitution in 1787. And she hosted people in her house and hosted things that were called salons at the time. These were basically places, these are events for conversation between people of different ideas. And so she was called a salonist in the era, and was very influential for that reason. Here's a painting that probably gives us a better idea of what she actually looked like. And so she's someone that knew politics. And I'll give you an example of this. Her friend said this about her, and she's writing to Powell's sister. She said, "When in society, she will animate and give a brilliancy to the whole conversation. You know the uncommon command she has of language, and her ideas flow with rapidity. I sometimes think her patriotism causes too much anxiety. Female politicians are always ridiculed by the other sex." So this idea that women were not accepted as political actors at the time. And so Powell was really pushing against that. And so I find this so interesting that George Washington was open to learning from Powell and other women that could help him. And I think this was one of his strengths as a leader, certainly. And part of it might have to do with the fact that Washington himself didn't have much formal education. I know we have some middle school students with us today. Imagine this: in his formal schooling, George Washington really only made it through middle school. And after that, he really learned on his own independently for the rest of his life. And he loved to learn. He loved to collect books and read. But he always felt like he had been, robbed of that formal education, which he always admired very much. So take advantage of that education that you have. So so Washington wrote lots of letters to Elizabeth Willing Powell, got a lot of advice, and maybe her biggest single contribution was helping to convince George Washington to have a second term as president. When he finished his first term in 1792, he really thought that he was done, that he was going to go back to Mount Vernon, that he'd helped to start this new national government, but that he wasn't needed anymore. And Powell helped to convince him that no, actually, we need you very much. And the reason why is what I described, that the world was, soon going to be consumed by war between France and Great Britain. And Washington's own cabinet was fracturing, and there was political parties emerging in the new United States. And so Powell wrote George Washington a 7-page letter, basically helping him to convince him to stay on for a second term. And he did. And of course, he didn't actually retire until the end of his second term. And this is how he did it. He published what's known as his farewell address in a Philadelphia newspaper. And then I find this really interesting. He rode on horseback back to Mount Vernon on the same day this was published in September of 1796. He wasn't going to have anybody convince him to stay for a third term. And one of George Washington's great contributions to American history is stepping down from power. And that original cabinet member, Alexander Hamilton, helped George Washington to compose this farewell address. And it's great that he did step down from power because, as it would turn out, George Washington died in December of 1799. And if he'd remained president, he likely would have died in a different way. But if we imagine he still passed away in December of 1799, that would have been in the middle of his third term, and would have sent the message that somebody was a president for life. So it's good that he stepped down. and that he left us all these amazing institutions, including the cabinet. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and just thank you. And I'm going to dip into the chat, and we're gonna look at some questions. Let's see, maybe I'll stop my share here. And wow, we got so many great questions. Thank you all for sharing. And it looks like we could start maybe with a question that came in, and it is, um, where actually does the term cabinet and these ideas of secretary come from? Such a good question, and I think that again goes back to this British. There's so many things in American political culture that go back to the British. I think that the way we think about a cabinet actually holding things together, it's almost kind of this image that we can almost imagine of different people coming together. And such a good question. And there's a similar question that kind of goes back to the roots of things and says, why is it good to have a debt? Such a fun question, because today we're so nervous about our debt, right? We're so worried about how big our debt has gotten. Hamilton wanted a debt because he thought this is what great nations do, is that great nations invest in different things, and that a debt would actually bind the American people together in a common project. And I think for most of American history, the debt has actually served a useful purpose, again, of investment, of growth, in the same way that people have to take out student loans in order to become, educated, or a loan to buy a house. It can be good forms of debt, but it certainly can get out of control. Right? So this is something we need to be wary of. Let's see. So we have some fans of Hamilton. That's good to know, because uh, uh, part of me was worried that, I know Hamilton was so popular, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and it's not quite as popular as it used to be, but it's definitely worth checking out. Let's see. Good question that came in. Why did Hamilton decide to leave the cabinet? So Thomas Jefferson left first in 1793, and Jefferson's reasons are pretty clear. He was pretty fed up with George Washington's administration, that Washington kept siding with Hamilton. And there's a great song in the musical that's, basically says it's great to have Washington on your side. And that's what Hamilton did, is he had Washington on his side. Um, and and Hamilton, for a lot of different reasons, a lot of them family, I think he was just burnt out. That, this was such an intense job. He had done so much, and he'd gotten through his financial program. Congress didn't pass his manufacturing bill, but all these other things like the national bank and the national debt were going to help to set in motion a manufacturing economy. So I think he could rest easy. Did Washington have any regrets about his cabinet? So this is another good question. Washington was really disappointed in the birth of political parties. Washington wanted, basically all Americans to agree that they were all just for America, that would be the main party, the American party. And he worried that parties were self-interested, that they were in it for themselves. And he really appreciated this concept and this word that he used called disinterest, to be disinterested, which today we use that word and we say that somebody's just bored or not interested if they're disinterested. But for him, it meant the opposite of self-interest. And so he didn't want people to be self-interested. And that's what he was worried about with political parties. But by the end of his life, George Washington, I think, was basically a Federalist. He was beginning to act in a much more partisan way. So I think even George Washington came to some kind of conclusion that political parties, were necessary on some level. Let's see. So a couple more questions, and then I think we're going to turn it over to look at a few of the other resources at Mount Vernon. So Hamilton's part in the Revolutionary War. This is a question that came up, and it's such a good question. And I encourage you to read more about this, but just to give you the real basics, George Washington wanted Hamilton as a secretary, as this position I refer to as aide de camp, because Hamilton was so brilliant. But Hamilton wanted to fight. He wanted to be a hero in the Revolutionary War. And he finally got his chance as a colonel in the Battle of Yorktown in October of 1781. really important battle that helped to secure victory for the Americans. So Hamilton really had it all ways in the Revolutionary War. And we'll do two last questions. One of my favorite cabinet member. Oh my gosh. I guess I am pretty impressed with what Hamilton did. He wasn't perfect. He was very human. He made a lot of mistakes, but these ideas that he had were so powerful and really did transform the country. And last question for now, let's see. Didn't Martha Washington refuse Jefferson's visit of condolences after Washington died? Okay, great question. So you probably heard the term frenemy, right? Which is kind of a combination of friend and enemy. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson went from friends to frenemies to basically almost enemies by the end of Washington's life. And Thomas Jefferson did express his condolences after George Washington died to Martha Washington. And it was not something that Martha was super excited about, especially when Thomas Jefferson asked for George Washington's prized globe. He wanted to keep this beautiful globe that George Washington had. And Martha Washington said, absolutely not. That's going to stay at Mount Vernon. So there was some bad feelings between the families. And so, Teresa, if I have time, I can share my screen again and we can talk about the Mount Vernon resources. Does that sound okay for the last few minutes?
Yep, you have about 4 minutes.
All right, we can do it. All right. All right.
Okay, I
So,
will be very, very quick.
yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Denver. That was a fantastic presentation. And if anyone's wondering, Hamilton's probably my favorite cabinet member too. Okay, so quickly, I just wanted to share a few resources that Mount Vernon has. Now, I know it's not always possible for students across the country to visit Mount Vernon in person, which is why we like to have resources which brings Mount Vernon right into your classroom. So as you can see on the right, we have a number of digital classroom resources. We have a virtual tour, which is self-guided or self-directed, which has a number of fun videos, fun facts. So that is something that you can do to explore the mansion and the estate. As Denver mentioned during his presentation, Mount Vernon was a plantation, and we have a lot of stories of enslaved individuals who lived and worked at Mount Vernon in our Lives Bound Together virtual exhibit. Aside from that, of course, we have videos, we have primary sources, and another really interactive game that we have is Be Washington, which covers 4 critical scenarios in Washington's life and career. And it gives you the opportunity to really step into his shoes, see the conflicts that he faced and the decisions that he had to make. And it gives you the opportunity to lead. So I'd love for all of you to check out these resources. Thank you, Teresa. Teresa, you just plugged our website. And thank you so much for having us here today.
Yeah,
I'm done.
absolutely. Thank you. It's so much fun. Thanks for all the great questions. You guys are all stars.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to everyone who came and for your great questions. And thank you to our presenters. We so appreciate all your expertise and all your time today.